Hello again, and welcome to lecture number 38 in our series on the foundations of Western civilization. This time we're going to talk about the scholastic culture of Europe in the High Middle Ages. Now, scholasticism is a convenient sort of catch-all term for the dominant Latin culture of the intellectual life of high medieval Europe. A few preliminary considerations may help us to place scholastic culture into some kind of perspective. Then we can go along and define that culture and then explore some of its major achievements. Let's begin backwards. Let's say that there was a Latin culture in the High Middle Ages that was not scholastic. The commonest form of Latin writing, for example, was letters. Now, some of these were elegant literary compositions, the correspondence of the star-crossed lovers Abelard and Heloise, for example. Most of it was bureaucratic and governmental. There survived, for example, thousands, literally thousands of papal letters, government documents of various kinds. Some of it was scholarly and friendly at the same time. Major figures such as Hildegard of Bingen or John of Salisbury, keeping up with their friends and discussing with them some of the great intellectual issues of the day. There were mystical writers such as Bernard of Clairvaux. We talked about him and his role in the spread of the Cistercian order of monks in the 12th century. There were also the monks of the school of St. Victor in Paris. Now, these were persons who wrote deeply affective treatises that were in important respects conceived in opposition to scholasticism. In other words, instead of the dialectical reasoning of scholasticism, more about that in a few minutes, these were treatises based on the necessity, the importance, the validity of immediate divine inspiration. Satire was revived from antiquity after it had been dormant for a long time. One of the most devastatingly clever and interesting of the satires of the 12th century in Latin was The Gospel According to the Silver Marks, which was a devastating critique of clerical wealth and excess. There was also a vast corpus of Latin poetry. Most of it was religious, but not all of it. For example, there were a group of student poems called the Goliard poems that in lots of ways provide some interesting insights into student life in the High Middle Ages, but also provide us with some sense of the uses to which poetry could be put. Here's an example of one of these Goliard poems. In the public house to die is my resolution. Let wine to my lips be nigh at life's dissolution. That will make the angels cry with glad elocution. Grant this drunkard, God on high, grace and absolution. Now, a figure like Peter Abelard, for example, can reveal the cross currents of his age. We'll meet him again in a little while as a significant philosopher, but he was also a poet. He wrote a poem called David's Lament for Jonathan. Now, it's a wonderful reflection on David and his great biblical friend Jonathan, but anyone, and that means everyone, who knew of Abelard's ill-fated love affair with Heloise will have heard this poem as something more than merely reflections on a biblical theme. Low in thy grave with thee happy to lie, since there's no greater thing left love to do, and to live after thee is but to die. For with but half a soul, what can life do? So share thy victory, or else thy grave, either to rescue thee or with thee lie. Ending that life for thee that thou didst save, so death that sundereth might bring more nigh. Peace, O my stricken lute, thy strings are sleeping. Would that my heart could still its bitter weeping. So, a great variety of non-scholastic Latin literature. Now, let's also remember that the cultural achievements of high medieval Europe would be utterly inconceivable without the economic and geographic expansion of the age. Economic and geographic. People went further and encountered more than ever before. In places like Sicily, for example, in the Crusader states created in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Spain, there were encounters, repeated encounters, of Latins with the learnings of the Arab and Jewish world, with scholars from other traditions, with renewed acquaintance with Greek works. For example, between about 750 and 900, way off in Persia, Christians translated a great portion of Aristotle, as well as many of the ancient commentaries on Aristotle, into Arabic. And these then began to circulate in the Islamic world. This led to a number of brilliant thinkers in the Islamic world, such as, for instance, let's just have a few examples. Ibn Sina lived from 980 until 1037, familiarly called Avicenna in the West. Avicenna turned himself to old questions about the relationships between things that actually exist in the world and things that exist only in the mind. These were the old and great Platonic questions of antiquity, but also, of course, the great Aristotelian questions. Ibn Rushd, 1126 to 1198, called Averroes in the West, tried to understand the kinds of truths that could be acquired by human reason and those that depended upon divine revelation. The point, quite simply, is that for Islamic thinkers, as indeed for Jewish thinkers, as indeed for Christian thinkers, Aristotle posed a bit of a problem. Knowledge was a good thing. Good things come by the grace of God. Aristotle knew a great deal, but Aristotle was a pagan. So is it possible to know many things without necessarily having to depend upon divine reason? And how does one draw distinctions between what one knows by reason and what one knows by divine revelation? Now, Averroes, for example, wrote more than 38 commentaries on Aristotle's writings. Some of these were translated into Latin in Spain and then began to circulate very widely in Northern Europe. Now, there were also Jewish scholars who were asking fundamental questions along very much the same lines. Solomon ibn Gebirol, for example, 1021 to 1070, called Avisabron in the West, also set himself the task of trying to find ways to reconcile Aristotle with the Jewish faith. Moses ben Maimon, 1135 to 1204, called Maimonides, rather like Averroes, tried to find ways to reconcile the competing claims of faith and of reason. Another Jewish scholar, Solomon ben Isaac, 1040 to 1105, called Rashi in the West, was one of the greatest Talmudic scholars of all time. Now, the Talmud is a commentary on the scriptural studies of the ancient rabbis who themselves commented on the Hebrew scriptures. There were two great versions of the Talmud that circulated, one prepared in Babylon, one prepared in Palestine. And these were and are very important sources of learning and of spiritual inspiration in the Jewish world. Well, Rashi and then his sons taught in the city of Troyes in France. And sometimes they were consulted by Christian scholars who were interested in understanding certain very complex points in the Hebrew Scriptures, or in the Old Testament, as Christian scholars referred to the Hebrew Scriptures. So, the first point then is to see this enormous array of cultural contexts, unthinkable in the earlier Middle Ages, and now not only thinkable, but omnipresent in the world of the High Middle Ages. Now, a first great change in Western intellectual life in the High Middle Ages, in the scholastic world, has to do with the elevation of logic to paramount status among the intellectual disciplines. You'll recall perhaps that in the Carolingian period, grammar, the teaching of basic Latin, was the key discipline. We're going to see later that in the Renaissance, we'll move to rhetoric. But now, logic has its day. Why? Why did people begin to focus particularly on the study of and the application of logic? Well, some writers began to use logic quite effectively, quite successfully, to deal with, to understand certain controverted issues. Let's give just a couple of examples. Lanfranc, for example, an Italian who eventually migrated to the north, became Archbishop of Canterbury, born in 1010, died in 1089, began by using patristic authorities and biblical statements, and then gradually turned to the use of dialectic, to the use of logic, to rebut the teachings of a man by the name of Berengar. Now, Berengar had challenged the then reigning doctrine in the church that the Eucharist, the communion, was truly the body and blood of Christ, the doctrine of the real presence, as the Catholic Church speaks of it. Berengar said, no, this is really just symbolic. Now, in the past, before Lanfranc, what one would have done is quoted papal letters to such a person, one would have quoted church council decrees to such a person, one would have quoted the writings of a church father to such a person, one would have quoted passages of Scripture to such a person. One would have heaped up authorities. Lanfranc changed and rebutted Berengar by the use of extremely precisely wrought dialectical reasoning. Anselm of Canterbury, Another Italian who migrated to the north and who became Archbishop of Canterbury after Lanfranc, born in 1033, died in 1109, probably the most gifted logician since antiquity, certainly one of the most gifted logicians in all of human history. Now, Anselm turned himself, among many other problems, to an ingenious proof for the existence of God. And this again shows us this connection between things that exist in the mind and things that exist in the real world. He began with the statement of the fool in the Psalms, who said, "It seems there is no God." And he asked himself, is it possible for the fool to have in his mind the idea of something that does not actually exist in the world? Well, if you think of a leprechaun, for example, or a unicorn, you can say, well, yes, that's possible. I can have something in my mind that doesn't exist in the world. But then Anselm says, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. For it would be absurd to imagine a being greater than God. Now, there must be a being than which no greater being can be conceived, and therefore, in this instance, something which exists in the mind must exist also in reality. Now, there are one or two problems with that form of reasoning. It's called ontological reasoning, but it is quite a remarkable leap. We might say leap of faith, no, leap of reason. Peter Abelard, who lived from 1079 to 1142, and whose beautiful lament on Jonathan we heard a few moments ago, used dialectical reasoning in one of his books, a book called the Sic et Non, that means yes and no, to show that in more than 100 cases, seeming contradictions, either in the Bible, particularly contradictions between the Old and the New Testament, or seeming contradictions in the writings of the Church Fathers, could, by the careful application of dialectic, of logic, be reconciled and be demonstrated to be not, in fact, contradictions at all. Now, what were some of the consequences of this increasing application of dialectic? Well, in the first place, logical reasoning began to be seen as equal to, and perhaps in a few instances at least, superior to authorities when settling a controverted issue. In the past, one would have heaped up authorities. Remember, Lanfranc began that way. Now we begin to see the application of formal logic as equal, maybe even superior. Now, this began to call into question the respective spheres of faith and reason. Now, we've seen that Arab thinkers were interested in this question. We've seen that Jewish thinkers were interested in this question. So it's not surprising that eventually Christian thinkers began also to explore this very complicated subject. Logic had an impact on teaching methods and on scholarship in the medieval schools. We'll see a couple of concrete examples of that in just a few minutes, but suffice it to say that in a world where logic reigns supreme, the way you teach and the way you study and the way you write will change just a little bit. Now, the enhanced status of logic is perhaps the key motor that drove the rise of what we call scholasticism. Now, this word is one that can be used and abused. It can have several distinct, though related, meanings. Let's explore this word a little bit. Key point here is that there isn't just one thing that scholasticism was or to which it attached. It can be, for example, in the first place, quite simply, a name for a period of time, especially the 12th and 13th centuries, when the competing claims of faith and reason were explored, and indeed were explored particularly by the application of dialectical reasoning. Now, we've already seen this in connection with Arab, Jewish, and Latin thinkers. And we'll return to this question a little bit later in connection with St. Thomas Aquinas. But first of all, scholasticism can mean exploring faith and reason by means of logic. Having said that, it's very important to emphasize that the great logicians of the Middle Ages were not rationalists in the modern sense. Reason was for them a means to an end. It was not an end in itself. Human reason was not final, was not complete, and was not perfect. Anselm's motto, for example, was faith seeking understanding. He began by believing, and then he set out to understand. Now, it's worth emphasizing that there were thinkers, for example, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, whom we've met a number of times, the great mystic, along with the Paris mystics, those of the school of St. Victor, and along with mystical female writers, Hildegard of Bingen, for instance, who objected to this application of logic. They thought it playing God. They thought it arrogant. They thought it pompous. They preferred the quieter, the more peaceful, the more traditional means of biblical exegesis, spiritual reflection, and immediate divine inspiration. So, scholasticism equals logic, yes, means more than that, and there were people who objected. Scholasticism can mean schoolism, and therefore it can refer to the masters, to the books, to the curriculums, and to the attitudes of the medieval schools. It can attach, in other words, simply to what went on in the medieval schools. Yes, logic had an important place, but we can say more generally, it just applies to the schools. Now, the 12th century saw a progression, for example, from the great monastic schools, eventually to the great cathedral schools in Paris, at Chartres, and other places in France, to the dawning universities of Europe. More about those universities in a little while. Now, there were also certain teachers, Peter Abelard is a very good example, who attracted followers no matter where they were. Students came from all over Europe. Intellectual culture began to be a more international, it would probably be an exaggeration to say cosmopolitan, but certainly a more international phenomenon than had ever been the case before. Now, the scholastic method, in other words, if we talk about schoolism, involved the very close reading of set texts, coupled with the commentaries on those texts. So the teacher would, for example, take a text of Aristotle, would read out a short passage, would explain any difficult or complex words, would then read to the students one or another of the great commentaries on that particular passage. The teacher would then offer his own views. There were important women intellectuals, but not, formally speaking, women teachers. The teacher would offer his own views, perhaps wrap up any problems, and then read the next piece of the set text, and then go through the same process again and again and again. Now, there's something old and something new here. New, many of the texts themselves, particularly a lot of the Aristotle. New, the application of dialectical reasoning to reasoning out the problems, contradictions, difficulties of interpretation hiding in these texts. Old, however, was that for a very long time, scholars had normally taken the Bible and glossed it. Now, we say today, well, I'll put a gloss on that. In other words, I'm going to explain that to you. I'm going to offer my views on this. I'm going to offer a comment on this. Well, in the earlier Middle Ages, and we have large numbers of surviving manuscripts that look exactly this way, one would have taken a manuscript and written comments, either between the lines or in the margins of the page. Gradually, in the 12th century, those glosses began to be separated from the text they glossed, and also in the 12th century, in other words, there began to be commentaries that are published separately. And then, moreover, the glosses were no longer applied particularly or exclusively to the works of Scripture or to the Church Fathers, but now perhaps to Aristotle, for instance. So, something old and something new. So we find that an old way of instruction was adapted, adopted, and changed. Now, scholasticism can also refer to a particular method of formal reasoning based on dialectical analysis. There were a number of scholars, for example, who began to tackle whole fields of knowledge in a systematic way, in ways that had never really been done before. Now, they either arranged their material according to certain systematic principles, or they set out and asked a series of questions and argued out possible answers to these questions. Let me give a couple of concrete examples to try to make this a little clearer. A monk from the city of Bologna, actually he worked and taught in Bologna, he was himself German. His name was Gratian. He began about 1140 to publish his Concordance of Discordant Canons. Well, we call this book the Decretum. But you notice, Concordance of Discordant Canons, a bit like Abelard's Sic et Non. What this was is a rational, topical, systematic presentation of the law of the Church that sought to reconcile contradictions, to reconcile unclarities. It founded in many ways the science, we might say the jurisprudence, of canon law. But the point is now that the law of the Church was organized systematically. Even clearer as an example of this kind of work is the Book of Sentences, or the Books of Sentences, 4 books, by the scholar Peter Lombard. The Lombard was born about 1100, died in 1160. He taught in Paris. Now, what is a sentence? A sententia, in Latin, is a conclusion reached at the end of a process of logical reasoning. Now, what does logical reasoning look like? It works through what are called syllogisms. Now, everyone is familiar with certain basic syllogisms, whether we're really aware of it or not. We may take a very simple but effective example. all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. The conclusion Socrates is mortal is a sententia. It comes at the end of a process of reasoning. And in that process of reasoning, I must array my premises correctly. I must draw valid and not invalid conclusions. The sententia itself, then, can pose as a new quaestio, as a new question, which permits me then to open a new issue. Socrates is mortal. I might then ask, what is mortality? I could argue that one out, you see? So I can argue through a proposition, arrive, and perhaps I should say there, I can argue through a proposition, which means conduct a disputatio, a disputation. I can pose a quaestio, engage in a disputatio, pose a question, and engage in a disputation, an argument, the argument's usually with myself, and then draw a sententia, a conclusion. And the conclusion can then itself be framed as a new question. Now, as I go through, the logical processes, the syllogisms, need not be as simple as the one I evidenced a moment ago. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. In fact, what I can do is argue through a case, and this is usually the way the scholastics did it, and arguing for a proposition, against a proposition. I can use my own arguments, I can use the arguments of other scholars, my contemporaries, or those in the past. Now, what the Lombard did was organize essentially all of Catholic theology into his 4 books, treating, in the first place, the Trinity. In the second place, creation and sin, the human condition. In the third place, the incarnation and the virtues. And finally, last things. This was the first systematic treatment of the theology of the Catholic faith, and it was influential as a textbook for centuries. Now, in the 13th century, we begin to see large-scale treatments of whole realms of knowledge, and these treatments are called summas. The greatest of these were prepared by Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1225 until 1274. His Summa contra Gentiles, the Summa against the Gentiles, was basically his systematic presentation of, assessment of, and reflections on pagan knowledge. Everything that the Gentiles knew. In other words, everything that the pagans of antiquity in particular knew. His second great Summa was the Summa Theologiae. This was a presentation of the major doctrines of the Catholic Church, again arrayed systematically. Now, scholasticism, urbanization, the increasing sophistication of life in general, slowly gave rise to a new and distinctive institution, the university. Now, the medieval name for this institution was Studium Generale, that is to say, a place where all studies could be pursued. The name universitas applies more particularly to the legal status of the whole, of the totality, university, universitas, whole, totality, of the scholars who made up the university. In other words, universitas is really a legal term for the guild. In Northern and Southern Europe, certain common forces combined to create the university, but with rather different outcomes. For example, in Paris, in the north, first at Paris, then slowly in other places as well, Cologne, Oxford, Cambridge, and so on, the teaching masters in the schools banded together to form a guild, just like the guilds that organized in medieval towns and other social and economic realms, to regulate admissions to their own ranks, to set courses, to set examinations, to set fees for students, to represent themselves to the bishop's chancellor, who was normally the head of schools in a town. In other words, the Northern University springs from a guild of masters. The teachers organized themselves. In the south of Europe, law and medicine were the key subjects studied, so the students tended to be a little bit older. In these circumstances, it was the students who banded together to make certain claims on the masters in the areas of fees, in the areas of teaching, in the areas of scheduling, in the areas of examining the conferral of degrees, and so on. As a teacher, I take some satisfaction from the fact that the more distinguished of Europe's universities were those organized by the teachers. In the normal pattern, a university would have 4 faculties: arts, theology, law, and medicine. The arts faculty, Paris was the most famous of these, though virtually every university had an arts faculty, prepared students to teach in schools, to take positions in the church, to advance to one of the higher faculties. Theology was the queen of the sciences and considered the highest faculty, the highest area of study. Paris was the greatest of the theology faculties, though Cologne and Oxford were important as well. The study of law, both civil, Roman law, and canon, ecclesiastical law, was also prominent. Bologna in Italy was the greatest of the medieval law schools. Medicine, based very much more on a close study of the ancient medical writers, Hippocrates, Galen, etc., than on experimental science or clinical practice, was taught in quite a number of centers in Europe, but those in the south were most prominent: Montpellier in the south of France and Salerno in Italy. What was student life like? Well, pretty tough in lots of ways. Students were always technically foreigners. They'd come from someplace else to go to the universities. They were preyed upon by unscrupulous landlords, by innkeepers, by prostitutes, and sometimes even by their teachers themselves. The period of study was very long, the precise length, at least in the arts, depending somewhat on a student's preparation. As few as 3 or 4 years, as many as 8 to take the first degree. Degrees were awarded by public examination before the faculty. They could just fire questions at you, instead of, as today, by the accumulation of credits. A very different system. Medieval students actually had to demonstrate that they knew something. The university has proved to be one of the most flexible and durable of all Western institutions. This really is quite an important legacy of the Middle Ages to the modern world. Now, to get a sharper sense of the Latin learning in the age of scholasticism, let's use some examples that will perhaps bring this forward in a more concrete way. Let's mention, for example, Thomas Aquinas. Now, we referred to him a moment ago for his Summas. Born again 1225, died in 1274. He was born in a small town south of Rome and sent at about the age of 5 to Monte Cassino, Benedict's great monastery, where his noble father expected him one day to become the abbot. But in 1240, Thomas was sent off to Naples to study arts. While he was there, he was attracted by the intellectual apostolate of the Dominicans. Remember one of those new mendicant orders we spoke of in an earlier lecture? His parents strongly opposed this, but nevertheless, in 1244, Thomas joined the Dominican order. In 1245, he went to Paris. He studied there for about 3 years, and then he came under the influence of Albert the Great and of the newly emerging texts of Aristotle. Albert then transported himself to Cologne, and Thomas went with him, stayed there for a few years. In 1252, he came back to Paris. He taught there until 1259. He then departed partly on the business of his order, the Dominicans, and partly for other academic responsibilities, to Italy. He stayed there until 1269, when he returned to Paris and taught until 1274, when he died at the relatively young age of 49. Thomas was a prolific writer, first of all. To stand in the library in front of the collected works of Thomas Aquinas is to be humbled. He made contributions to many of the great philosophical and theological problems of his days. His ideas were formed by his travels. They were formed by his experience in several schools. They were formed by the burgeoning contemporary interest in Aristotle, as well as in the Arab and Jewish commentators on Aristotle. They were formed by the practical needs of teaching, and they were formed by the increasing dominance of logic in the schools. Central to Thomas's thought was the problem of the relation between faith and reason. On the one hand, Thomas explored the respective roles of the will and of the intellect. Faith, for example, is a matter of the will. In consciously granting assent to something, I do not commit an act that is contrary to reason. Nevertheless, I may agree to something that is not demonstrable by reason. On the other hand, Thomas spoke of natural and revealed truths. Many things can be known by the unaided use of human reason. 2 and 2 is 4. Some religious things can be known by reason too. Thomas thought, for instance, like Anselm, the existence of God. But there are some things that can only be known by faith, that can only be known by revelation. The Trinity, for example. The doctrine of the Trinity is not something to which reason will bring you. The doctrine of the Incarnation, God made man, is not something that reason will bring you to. Or, in a much more Aristotelian vein, creation out of nothing. Thomas's systematic exposition of Catholic teaching was always influential to a degree, but in the 19th century, it was made the basis for official Catholic teaching, official Catholic theology, and given the name Thomism, and it held that position until the Second Vatican Council between 1962 and 1965. Thomas's career then illustrates for us in a number of ways some of the fundamental cross-currents of this age. Yes, this is an urbanized world. It is a world of great wealth. It is a world of vast resources. It is a world where ideas are circulating more widely than ever before. It is a world where Latin learning is still dominant is still regnant, though as we'll see in our next lecture, it's beginning to be challenged by vernacular learning. It's a world where a series of great intellectual traditions are encountering one another seriously and for the first time. The scholastic culture of high medieval Europe is one, only one, but one of that remarkable period's most important achievements and legacies to the tradition of Western civilization.